Polygroups are a bit confusing for beginner ZBrush users, so in this video I'm going to try to show you a few of the fundamentals of polygroups so you can start using it in your projects right now. Hope you enjoy.
In my opinion, the most important thing you need to know about polygroups is how to navigate them, how to select them, how to invert them, all of that stuff. All the complicated stuff comes a bit more naturally once you're able to navigate between them and create them. So let's do some tests. To view the polygroups and the wireframe of your model, you can use the shortcut Shift F. That shows you everything, and this polygroup is a yellow color. You can also use this button. So if you noticed, if you press Shift F, this turns on. You can also turn off the lines if you want to by pressing, it's very small, but if you press that word, line, and also fill, you can just have the wireframe or you could just have the fill. But by default, both of them will be on. Now to create a polygroup, it's Control W, but because everything is visible and nothing is masked, it just re-polygroups this entire sphere. If I wanted to polygroup a certain amount of polygons, I can use a mask, which hopefully you know about, but if you don't, you can hold Control and just click and drag on your mesh, and that creates a mask. So a mask just makes it so that part doesn't get affected by whatever you're doing. Oh, it looks like a dinosaur, little baby dinosaur. But the good thing is, if you use the Control W shortcut again, you will create some polygroups. Now, why do we want polygroups? I can create a bunch of different polygroups now. This is great. I've learned something. Amazing. What good is this though? So we're going to learn how to navigate polygroups and how to select certain ones. At first I definitely found it a bit confusing because a lot of the time, like masking, if you mask something and then click off, you're inverting it, so you kind of have to think a few steps ahead for whichever piece you want to select. But it's essentially the same as masking in a lot of ways, so you can press Control and Shift. This should pop up on the left, but don't worry about that for now. And if you click any of these polygroups, it solos it out, which is amazing. And I'll show you why in some real life cases later, but we're just going to learn the basics for now. Now, say I want to select this polygroup and this polygroup. So to do that, okay, I'm going to hold Control and Shift, I'm going to click it, and okay, how do I get this other polygroup now? So it's pretty easy. To do this now, you just have to hold Control and Shift, click and drag, so not just a normal click. Click and drag so you see this box. And now it's inverted the entire selection. And now if I were to hold Control and Shift and click this one, it disappears. I didn't actually select it or solo it out. If you recall what you could do to invert your polygroup selections, you can try and practice that now if you have ZBrush open, or I'll just tell you right now. Again, click and drag and boom. It's kind of a roundabout way of being able to select things, but once you get the workflow down and you get it in your motor memory, it becomes quite fast, it becomes quite natural. So this means you could either choose to select something, or select 2 things, 3 things even. So invert it, click, click, invert it again. I've selected all these. Oh, I just want this green and this yellow one to be selected. So I'll select that, boom, and then it's inverted now. And to bring back all of the polygroups that have been hidden, you just hold Control and Shift and left click. Don't click and drag, just left click. And they're both back. Why do we want polygroups? One of the ways we can use polygroups is to solo out a piece of your geometry and essentially just work on it without affecting other things. So it's kind of like a permanent mask where you can select it whenever you want. You don't have to redraw out the mask, and then after it, it has all of the topology that's been affected. Maybe the borders of 2 polygroups will be affected by it, but for the most part, the rest of the geometry isn't affected. So that's one reason. You can also use a combination of polygroups and masking to very quickly mask pre-polygrouped areas together. So if I just select this, Control Shift, left click, and then I hold Control and just click outside, that's all completely masked. And then, there we go. Now that polygroup is masked and I can do everything around it. It's a bit scary. God. This can be particularly good for face meshes. If you wanted to, you could polygroup the top lip and the bottom lip. Obviously do this a little more clean. Oftentimes character artists would have this lower jaw area in a separate polygroup, so it would probably look something like this. A bit cleaner, obviously, but then that allows them to select it mask it, and then just bring it all back again. Invert the mask and feather it out a bit. And now you're able to very quickly mask off the rest of the face and leave the bottom lip exposed for editing. So yeah, it's just a lot quicker than having to kind of mask everything again and just do it all manually. And it's always going to be consistent as well, so you can always just do that and then mask it, and then everything will be the same. Another thing you can do with polygroups is if you go to deformations and polish, there's a few different types of polish here, but the one we're going to be interested in is polish by groups, as you can imagine. And let's just see what happens when I do this. Look at that, isn't that weird? So it smooths out all of these polygroups so that they're this sort of like blob. But this means that we can also pair this with ZRemesher. So ZRemesher will take these borders between polygroups into account if we click keep group. So I'll just bring it up in here. So if you go to geometry, go to ZRemesher, and then there should be a button where you can keep groups. So if you click that, just give it a ZRemesh and see what happens. It completely follows the polygroups with some really nice edge flow. So the cool thing with this is that you can basically manipulate the geometry to look however you want it to be. It's good for hard surface stuff as well. If you maybe you're creating some kind of something like this and you want it to protrude out, let's do that. Polygroup it. Then if we smooth groups, so if we slowly move the poly count a bit lower, keep ZRemeshing it, and now we have these, you know, nice shapes here, and with workable topology, so it's low enough for me to use maybe ZModeler with it. Again, you can select these things, and even when it's selected, you can even mask it, and then you can create a polygroup out of this one. Now you have two polygroups. If I press B and I press Z and M, or just click it here, you can select ZModeler, and the power of ZModeler is that a lot of the options that you can access here, so if you press spacebar, if you hover over a polygon, an edge or a point, and you press spacebar, you have all of these different actions you can use, but the main one we're going to try and play with today is QMesh. In the middle box, so the box underneath the action, you can select a target, and polygroups just so happen to be some of the targets. So if you want to, say, extrude all of the polygroups, or the entire polygroup, sorry, you can do that and then click and drag on the polygon, and boom, now you have a very clean extruded polygon. So it's like hard surface modeling in a way. The great thing about QMesh as well is instead of extruding these sections out and these not connecting, if I were to do this, it automatically connects, which I don't know what wizardry someone came up with to create that, but all the props to them. So now with just two polygroups, I've created this really intricate shape on top of this very organic form, which was a sphere. You can just imagine what other things you can do. If you also select polygroup border, it checks the polygroup and it checks which polygons are on the border of the polygroup. And if I just click it up like that, amazing, you have a trim. Yeah, you can use this for a multitude of things, so I'd really recommend exploring the Polygroup ZModeler duo because it will help you a lot. Now I just want to show you a few examples of how I've used polygroups in this current character project that I've been working on. The first instance is with the little wraps on Jace's leg. So I've created different strips and made sure they all had different polygroups. I could have kept them as one polygroup, which would have been fine, because I could manipulate them with Move Topological, which moves just a piece, an individual piece within your mesh, as opposed to the Move Brush that moves everything. But keeping them separate means that I could focus on one and not have the others intercept at all. So even if I could use Move Topological, I couldn't really see very well. Like if I wanted to put one under the other like that, it would be hard to select the one I want. But if I press Ctrl and Shift and I just move it to where I want it to be, then I don't have to worry about it intersecting with the other one, and then I'll just keep adjusting it. And yeah, here I used polygroups to define each face of the pauldron. When I use polish by groups, it will keep this really sharp edge here, and then I can add subdivisions and detail it, add thickness and all that quite easily, so it's a lot easier to work with. With the placement of Jace's hair, for the same reason as the straps on his leg, every little strand here is a different polygroup, just so it's a bit easier to solo each part out and move it around. Another principle of polygroups is that rather than having two subtools, so if I appended this and then I moved this to the side, okay, now I have two spheres. If I wanted two spheres, I could, instead of creating two separate subtools, I could just create it within the same subtool. I can do this quickly by just holding Control and clicking and dragging any move tool. So I can do that. And then if I use auto groups, which you can find under Polygroups and auto groups at the top, now I have, well, those are nice, quite nice colors. Then I can move both. If I wanted to move them with the gizmo, I would just have to select one of them and then hide the other, and then I can move it like that, as opposed to having this separate subtool where I'll have to alt click or just select it in the subtool category and then move it around like that. So it's just another way to organize your mesh. You can, if you prefer having a completely different subtool for specific parts of your mesh, then that's fine. It just depends on industry standard ways and also like what you kind of prefer. But this way you can also just see the mesh and the wireframe of the entire subtool that you select. So yeah.
Now I've only covered a few of the aspects of polygroups, so if you would like me to go more in depth into how you can use them on real projects, let me know in the comments below. Else please like and subscribe if this has helped you. And if you have a suggestion for a future video, please leave it down in the comments below for anything else you'd like to learn in the future. Peace.